Hello Netrunner fans and welcome to my review of Blood Money. This is the second data pack in the Flashpoint cycle. In this first part we're going to look at the runner cards. Part 2 we'll look at all the corp cards. The first card we're looking at is a new run event for Anarch. This is Credit Crash. It's 1 to play, it's 1 influence. Make a run. Trash the first non-agenda card you access during this run at no cost. The corp can spend credits equal to the res or play cost of the access card to prevent the trash. Here's a card effect that Anarch has had a few times in the past. The immediate comparison I would make is to Imp. Now, this card is certainly a lot less flexible than Imp, since you're going to have to trash that card you access during the run event. With Imp, you can kind of look at cards and decide whether or not you want to use Imp. And obviously with Imp, you're going to get 2 or maybe even 3 uses if you have Grimoire installed. And on top of that, with Imp, the corp doesn't have the ability to just pay the cost of the card, so that definitely hurts it as well. Now, one thing to point out is both with Imp and this, you can trash cards that don't have trash costs. So if you access a piece of ice, for example, you can trash it, something like that. The biggest thing this has going as an alternative to Imp is that it's only 1 influence. Imp is really pricey at 3 influence. That makes it so that you basically could only play 1, I would say at most, out of faction. Whereas with this, you could pretty easily play a couple of copies if it was a core effect you wanted. I don't know, this isn't overwhelming me. I don't think it really stacks up well against Imp, but I could see it seeing a little bit of play because the effect is decent. Next up, we have another event for Anarch. This is Rumor Mill. It's 1 to play, it's 2 influence, it's a current, which means this card is not trashed until another current is played or the corp scores an agenda. The text box of each unique non-region asset and upgrade is blank. This card is absolutely bonkers. This is easily one of the best currents, I would say, in the game, period. Really the only one that I think is competing on the runner side is Employee Strike. Man, this thing is good. So we need to talk about the range of cards that this affects. The first and most obvious is Jackson Howard. Basically, every corp deck that's ever existed has played 3 Jackson Howards, and this is going to make him blank. Now, we're also going to see things that defend servers, like Caprice or Ash, maybe Marcus Beatty or even Sandberg. Tons of things that people use to defend their servers are going to get blanked with this thing. There are also a few essential engine type cards that this shuts off. Like, I would cite Museum of History or Jeeves Mile Bioroids. Both of these are really essential components to the decks that play them. From there, we've got a whole class of fringe cards that see occasional play. I would put Chairman Hero, as well as all the executives, but Chairman Hero specifically, in addition to Genetics Pavilion. Those 2 cards tend to be used in combination with Ronin as a flatline mechanism. So this thing is really going to strike deep at cards that see play as central components to a bunch of different decks. And the fact that Jackson Howard is affected by this, I think really pushes it into the range where you're able to include it as a 1 or 2 of in virtually any Anarch deck. Shutting off Jackson alone is going to be really powerful. It could put the corp in a dangerous situation if they've got agendas in their archives and you hit them with this thing unexpectedly. I think Rumor Mill has a lot of potential. I expect it to see play right out of the pack, and I think it'll be a little bit of time before we realize exactly where this card is going to serve as a metagame position. But I definitely think this is something you've got to contend with if you're playing any of these powerful effects I just went through that Rumor Mill just utterly obliterates. Next up, we have a new program for Anarchs. This is NFR. It's 3 to play, 1 MU, 3 influence. It's an Icebreaker Fractor, and it starts with 1 base strength. When an encounter in which you used NFR to break all subroutines on that piece of ice ends, place 1 power counter on NFR. NFR has +1 strength for each power counter on it. Then it has credit break a barrier subroutine. Here's a variant on the fixed strength theme. It doesn't have the ability to pump its strength with credits, but as it breaks more ice, it's going to get stronger over time. Now that has the obvious problem of when you initially play it, it's not going to be able to break all that many ice unless you have like a data sucker or something like that that's going to help you match strength. Maybe if you used null as your ID, that could get around a little bit of the problem since you would have something right from the start of the game that could help you match strength. I don't know, this is not blowing me away, and especially since there's another fractor in this pack that's like insanely better than this, I'm kind of underwhelmed here. I also think that this doesn't stack up all that well with Corroder. Corroder is 1 less to install, has 1 more base strength, and is just infinitely easier to use since you don't have to worry about running into ice that you can't match strength on. The best thing I'll say about this card is that it costs 3 influence. And like I've said a bunch of times, I think the very best icebreakers, even just remotely playable icebreakers, should have a lot of influence, and so I like that part of this card. Next up, we have another fractor for Anarch. This is Paperclip. It's 4 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 3 influence, it's an icebreaker fractor, and it has 1 base strength. Whenever you encounter a barrier, you may install Paperclip from your heap, paying its install cost. Then it has X credits, plus X strength, break up to X barrier subroutines if able. Well, like with NFR, we need to compare this to Corroder to see if it's going to be worth playing. Now, the first and most obvious difference with Corroder is this costs twice as much to install, and it also costs 1 more influence than Corroder. Now, in exchange, we're getting not only this, you can install it from your heap thing, which is really nice for decks that feed tons of cards to the heap, maybe like Max, or something where you want a recurring icebreaker, you don't want to have to worry about getting it back. I could definitely see criminal decks being willing to spend that 1 extra influence versus Corroder, because they wouldn't have to worry about their fractor getting trashed and then they're hosed the rest of the game. And that would save you influence versus playing something like Clone Chip. I'd also point out that Paperclip being able to install itself from your heap is nice because it's going to save you that click of having to install Corroder, and that's kind of nice. Now, if we compare cost to break with Corroder, we're going to find that in a lot of situations, Corroder and Paperclip are very, very similar. There are a few situations, though, where Paperclip is better. I think the one that's probably going to come up the most is Eli. Eli is 1 less to break with Paperclip versus Corroder. That's pretty nice. Also, situations where there are lots of subs and strength. So something like Hadrian's Wall or Curtain Wall, these huge high-end barriers that have multiple subs and lots of strength, Paperclip can save us a credit or 2 there. This is definitely the first real in-faction challenger to Corroder, and I think there's a lot of situations where you're going to be willing to play this card. Like I mentioned in the past, if you're playing Max, this is probably going to be better than playing Corroder just because you can play it from your heap. Similarly, if you're playing like Making an Entrance or Inject, something like that is going to feed it to your heap. You're going to be able to reinstall it. And the fact that you don't have to worry about it getting trashed and then you're later screwed because you don't have a fractor is a really nice bonus. This is definitely going to see play. I think it's hard to say whether or not all decks are going to immediately play this over Corroder. I think both of them still have their merits, but this is definitely a challenger for Corroder. Next up, we have a new icebreaker for criminals. This is Golden. It's 5 to play, it's 1 MU, it's 2 influence. It's an icebreaker killer and it starts with 1 strength. It has 2 credits, break up to 2 century subroutines, 2 credits plus 4 strength, 2 credits, and return golden to your grip, de-res a sentry. Use this ability only after using golden to break all the subroutines on that sentry during a single encounter. At first glance, this thing is not particularly impressive. Within Criminal, we already have a ton of great ways to overcome sentries, especially Fairy and Mongoose are both going to not only be more efficient against a lot of sentries that we encounter, especially lower strength ones with multiple subs, which tend to be some of the scarier sentries, but they're also much, much cheaper to install. This thing at 5 install cost with kind of inefficient braking certainly isn't impressing me a whole lot. And when you add in that we have things like Alias and Garrote, we already have plenty of great options within Criminal to break sentries. This thing, the biggest advantage it has going for it is this last ability, which allows you to de-res sentries. Presumably, we're going to see that as an effect on other icebreakers. Maybe there'll be a Criminal set of these. I don't really find that all that impressive. Most of the scariest sentries tend to be low strength with lots of subs, and that's going to be really expensive to not only break, but then also pay this additional 2 to de-res, and then you're going to have to reinstall Golden if you ever want to break ice again. I'm not really all that impressed with this, but I think that if we saw a version of this that affected barriers or code gates, that would be a lot better. Generally speaking, those tend to be higher strength and have fewer subs, so that I think would really help. This Golden is really only going to be great against higher end sentries because it's going to be easier to match strength, and then when you de-res the higher end sentry, it's going to cost a lot more for the corp to re-res it. I think in the current metagame, even with like HB and some other decks using bigger sentries, this is really not that impressive, but I do like the idea of icebreakers having this a little extra utility at the cost of being slightly inefficient and having a big install cost. I also think that this might make more sense when we look at the ID later in this pack, so let's get to that. Next up, we have a new resource for Criminal. This is Tamuin Contract. It's 4 to play, it's 2 influence, it's unique, and it's a job subtype. Choose a server and place 20 credits from the bank on Tamuin Contract when you install it. When there are no credits left on it, trash it. Whenever you make a successful run on the chosen server, take 4 credits from it. Holy cow, this card is crazy good. I think Criminal players have felt for a long time that they've been getting screwed when it comes to especially economic tools, but also icebreakers and just generally credit management. And here's a card that's going to be a really, really awesome source of credits. And the biggest, most important point to make on this is that it stacks with other successful run effects. We've seen other things like, say, security testing that replace accesses. Well, that's decent, but it's not going to let you combo it with something like Siphon. This card, on the other hand, you're going to be able to siphon and still get the 4 credits as long as you make that successful run. And the fact that it also stacks on Desperado, on Data Sucker, Security Testing, John Masanori, you can just pile up all these successful run effects on a single run and make all kinds of money from that. Now, it's also kind of good to just install this thing and then name archives and run archives a bunch of times. That's going to be a pretty easy play if you just need some burst credits. It's going to be kind of like a liberated accounts in that way. This is one of those cards that's so obviously good, I don't really have a whole lot else to say about it. This is easily one of the highest yielding single cards in Netrunner, and I expect this to see a ton of play both in and out of the successful run economy deck that I was just talking about. Next up, we have a new ID for Criminal. This is Khan, Savvy Skip Tracer. She's a 40-12, and she's 0 link. She's a natural. The first time you pass a piece of ice each turn, you may install an icebreaker from your hand, lowering the install cost by 1. So this is the idea I was talking about earlier that has some obvious interaction with Golden. Golden returning itself to your hand is going to be decent with this since you're going to be able to reinstall it. You might make a similar argument about something like Chameleon. Pretty much anything where an icebreaker is going to be coming back to your hand by itself is going to be decent with this. Now, I am supremely underwhelmed with this ability. First of all, it only works the first time. So even if you do happen to pull this ability off, you're only going to be able to use it once per turn. Second of all, this only works when you pass a piece of ice. So in other words, in a lot of situations, you're going to run into a piece of ice, have to deal with it somehow, and then once you pass it, then you'll be able to install your icebreaker. Well, that's not too useful if you needed that icebreaker to break that first piece of ice. And then on top of that, you're only saving 1 credit on the install cost. That's really not that impressive, especially when you consider that there's a bunch of IDs that essentially give you like 1 credit every turn, or at least save you something like 1 credit of work every turn. This certainly isn't going to be able to do that. And the 12 influence, I think, is really the nail in the coffin. I don't necessarily mind IDs that have lower influence, but it seems to me like the best way to do IDs with lower than 15 influence is give them some really powerful ID power to compensate. And this is not powerful. To me, it seems like there's so little ability to utilize this to a huge gain. I mean, what's the absolute most you could possibly get out of this ID power? Like maybe if you built a Chameleon-based deck or something where you're just constantly reinstalling icebreakers, you could get, like 10, maybe 15 credits out of this in the whole game. And that's reasonably easy to do with a bunch of other IDs. 12 influence, I think, is going to be a mistake on this, but I would really like to see what type of support this ID is going to get in the future. It's obvious to me that we're going to see probably another couple icebreakers, and I think it's very possible that if those are good and are somehow easily exploited with her ability, maybe this ID could look a little bit more reasonable. For right now, I have to admit I'm kind of disappointed. Next up, we have a new run event for Shaper. This is Data Breach. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence. It's an event run type. Make a run on R&D. If successful, you may make another run on R&D when this run ends. Here's a way to get 8 credits from your Tamuin contract. I also immediately thought of Mirror. That's a card where if you could spam R&D a whole bunch, you could replace the stealth credits, and that might allow you to then have the credits you need to go break R&D again. That maybe is an option. I don't know, this card is okay. I don't really see a ton of decks wanting something like this, especially outside of Shaper, unless you really have tools that are all built on successful runs on R&D, like say maybe Medium or something like that. This card's just not going to be worth the deck slot. I think in a lot of situations you would rather access more cards with like Maker's Eye than you would make multiple runs. So it seems pretty contingent on the deck having cards in it that can benefit from a bunch of runs. This is a pretty logical card. It's not blowing me away, but I do think it could see some fringe play in the right deck. Next up, we have a new resource for Shaper. This is Algo Trading. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence, it's a job subtype. When your turn begins, you may move up to 3 credits from your credit pool to Algo Trading. When your turn begins, place 2 credits on Algo Trading from the bank if there are at least 6 credits on it. Then it has Click Trash, take all credits from Algo Trading. Quick rules clarification, keep in mind that when you have simultaneous when your turn begins abilities, you get to choose the order that they resolve. So you'll be able to move 3 onto it and then do the second part of it. Now, even with that, I don't think this card is particularly impressive. It's going to take a minimum of 2 turns after you install it in most situations before you even get any credits. And then on top of that, you've got to click trash it, which means you're vulnerable against like tag effects or things like that where you're pooling up a whole ton of credits on a card. I think that if you wanted something like this, there's already plenty of pretty good options, even just within Shaper or like neutral cards. And really the only thing that I see this has going for it is it's really cheap to install, so you could get it off early in the game. Now, maybe in the future, this could make more sense if we see more card effects that are either based on cards having credits on them, or like the runner being poor. Like it might be useful to bank some of your credits offshore your credits onto this thing. If there are corp cards that can only be played if the runner is rich, or if there are certain runner cards that you can only use if you're poor. But right now, I don't think we have a ton of that, and this just really isn't that impressive as just a strictly economy tool. The last runner card in the pack is also a Shaper resource. This is Beth Kilrain Chang. She's 2 to play, she's 3 influence, she's unique. She's a resource connection. If the corp has 5 to 9 credits when your turn begins, gain a credit. If the corp has 10 to 14 credits when your turn begins, draw a card. And if the corp has at least 15 credits when your turn begins, gain a click. This is a pretty sweet card, and I really like the mechanic of it relying on how many credits the corp has. That's necessarily interactive on both sides. The corp can play in such a way to have fewer credits or more credits based on what they want you to get. And the runner can also force the corp to spend credits or, not make runs, and then the corp will build up credits. So both players have a little bit of control over when these triggers will happen. Now, obviously, the most important thing about this is that you can gain a click from it. That's going to make it a lot easier to make more runs, to use something like Magnum Opus a bunch, to just generally be able to do more stuff in a turn. And we already have something like Notoriety. Occasionally, Apocalypse shows up in a Shaper deck. So that kind of thing, I think, is a lot easier to pull off when you have a card like this, giving you an extra click potentially. And 15 credits, that's really not that many. I think it's pretty easy for corp decks to get into situations, especially against Shaper decks that are generally a little slower, to get into situations where they have 15 credits. Getting that extra click is going to help so much, and drawing the card and even just the 1 credit is pretty good too. Very, very few situations is this card not going to net you more than the 2 that you put into it. So I really think this is going to see play in a pretty wide range of Shaper decks as like a 1, maybe 2 of, just because it always is going to do something useful. It's going to help you get set up early in the game, and then potentially later in the game, it's going to give you that extra click, which is really strong. That's going to do it for part 1 of my Blood Money review. Be sure to tune into part 2. We're going to look at all the corp cards. We had a really, really good runner half of the pack, and you have to see if we can top it over there on the corp half. Spoiler alert, probably not. But thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe, give me a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.